All right, tonight we're going to finish, Lord willing, Acts chapter 14. We went over last week. Remember all the stuff that was going on, how they were dealing with these people who chose not to believe, and they kept coming after them. Then there was a division between them, and God just showed His truth, and God brought many people to Christ. Yet there was still some opposition in the area. In verse 8, after some, they even wanted them to make them gods. They said, these are the Greek gods come down to us. They thought they were that. And then Paul and Barnabas says, not me. I'm just a man. No, don't do that to me. And so after they fully explained the gospel, still wanted to vainly worship them and sacrifice the men, but they continue to share the gospel. And verse 19 picks up right there. But the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having won over the crowd, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. Now, they weren't in Antioch anymore, but people came from out of town to stir up trouble. Does that sound familiar in the last couple of years? Not to get political. And for you to have sympathy for some of those who were protesting peacefully. I guess I'm going to get political. I'll just get over it. There were people who come in with evil intentions and cause these riots. Okay? There were people who were legitimately hurt. Whether it was justified or not, we can argue that. And I think justice was served with Chauvin. But they were hurt and felt a reason to protest. But people came out of town and caused mayhem and murdered people. This is kind of what's happening here. They came from another city, from Antioch and Iconium. They'd already got mad at them there and run them out of town, right? So they left. So instead of saying, we got them away from us, they followed them and continued to cause problems. It says that trouble followed Paul and Barnabas. Guzik said, the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came. These opponents were not content to kick Paul out of their own region. We've read that in 5 and 6 earlier in the chapter. They followed them and brought their persecution with them. He continues, says, some of these persecuting Jews from Antioch and Iconium traveled more than 100 miles just to make Paul miserable. They were dedicated adversaries of Paul. They traveled 100 miles. To us is no big deal, right? We drive. How far did we drive to West Virginia? And 300 something miles. That's no big deal now. But back then, 100 miles, that was a big deal. If you traveled hard, you could go 100 miles in 4 days. Maybe. Probably not. Probably more like a week or two. So they traveled more than 100 miles just to come after Paul and Silas. So, and it says here, but he came from Iconium, and having won over the crowd. Isn't it? It's funny how fickle this crowd is. But anyway, they won him over. And it says here, and having won over the crowd, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. Obviously, they thought they killed Paul. They killed him and drug him out of the city. The parable, these people who did this were the people who just earlier were trying to make them gods and were sacrificing to them. This same group of people got caught up in the thing, we're going to make them gods. Then the same group of people went out and stoned them. I think when in Mark a few weeks ago, we heard about people like this in the parable of the soils. That one day they received the gospel with joy, but because it didn't take root, they turned their back on the word that was sown. Here they even opposed it violently. Have you ever met anybody that's got saved and they were on fire for 6 months? Then you see them a year and a half later, and they hate the church. Timelines, that's just an example, but timelines thrown out there, you've seen this happen, right? People have been hurt by the church. Sometimes it's our fault that happens. Sometimes it just didn't take because they didn't have real faith. They were worshiping God, then they were stoning them, and it just kind of blows the mind that this would happen. Vincent said that certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium came thither, having heard it is likely that of the respect that was shown to Paul and Barnabas, and incensed these people against them. They didn't like the fact that these guys were getting honor. We run you out, now somebody else is going to give you honor. We're not letting that happen. Persuaded them to disbelieve their doctrine and represented them as impostors and perhaps as two wicked magicians who had endeavored to overturn everything sacred about them, both among the Jews and the Gentiles, or at least a seditious and dangerous person who ought to be harbored. In this way, they soon prejudiced the mind of the populace in such a degree against him that the very people who just would have adorned them as deities now rose in a tumultuous manner to put them to death as malefactors, being moved with equal ease either or to adore or to murder them. So short-lived are human passions not governed by reason and principle. Thus Israel fell into idolatry within 40 days from God giving them the law on Mount Sinai. Do you remember that? This is nothing new. Nor could Paul expect any better treatment when he considered that the same multitude had applauded Christ as King of the Jews and followed him with acclamations. About 6 days later, petitioned Pilate that he might be crucified and having stoned Paul. One thing he said here, I think he was referring back to the earlier part of this passage in the first few verses. He said that they disbelieved. Remember we talked about disbelief for a little bit? That's when people choose not to believe despite the evidence. They say, I refuse to believe this. It just hurts my heart when people do that. It just, all the evidence is laid out in front of them, and they know the truth, and you see the Spirit calling them, and then they say, I will not believe the truth. And that's what happened here. They drug him out of the city. That's interesting, too. They took him out of the city. Why? Why they drag him out of the city? They didn't want to lay in the streets. Maybe it was showing them, says, hey, you get out of here. We showed you, you're dead now, but we're not going to let you stay in the city. I don't know. Also, they drew him out of the city, supposing he is dead. This is addition to the barbarity and humanity. But they not only stoned him until he was dead, they supposed, but they dragged his body through the streets of the city. Maybe that's what they were doing. According to this Gill, that's what they were doing. It was like a parade. And the contempt of him, and indignation against him, and cast him out, and were left as an unworthy of a burial. He wasn't even good enough to be buried, according to them. I guess they hoped the dogs and stuff would eat him up. Remember, that happened to Jezebel. Remember, the dogs licked her blood, destroyed her. All right, verse 20. But when the disciples stood around him, he got up and entered the city, and the next day went with Barnabas to Derbe. Paul was miraculously revived. Guzik said Paul was miraculously preserved here. Some think that he was actually killed and raised to life again because stoning was usually a reliable form of execution. I guess so, right? You throw enough rocks at somebody, they're going to die. And it says, so when Paul later wrote, I bear in my body the marks of Jesus, Galatians 6:17, that may have laid in mind the scars of this incident. He certainly later referred to the stone in 2 Corinthians 11:25. It has been suggested that the heavenly vision described in Paul in 2 Corinthians 12 took place at this attack. This is possibly, but only conjecture. You know what I'm talking about when he talks in 2 Corinthians chapter 12? He says, I went to the third heaven. I don't know what was actually going on, but they talk about him going to the third heaven and seeing this. Some people think that it happened here. I always thought it was in Damascus. But this makes Damascus, he saw the great light. But maybe it was here. Guzik continues, it's reasonable to think that Paul remembered Stephen when he was being stoned and how it had been part of Stephen's execution. I bet that did come to his mind, didn't it? Remember, he held the coats there when it happened. But one thing struck me kind of weird here. Maybe it did you when you read it too. It says, but while the disciples stood around him, just think about that. They just stood around him. Why did they just stand around him? Were they too sad to do anything? Huh? Scared? Yeah. Were they praying? Were they wondering? I don't know. Maybe they pulled him outside. Maybe they protected him from the animals. But it's just kind of odd to me they just stood around him. Maybe because they didn't want to touch a dead body, because if a Jewish person touched a dead body, remember they're unclean. They can't have to stay unclean for a certain period of time. It just struck me weird here. He says the disciples stood around him. Maybe it said, "He's dead." Check and see if he's breathing. You check to see if he's breathing. Did I see something? See something move? You can imagine the scene. They were just like maybe taking a stick and poking him because they didn't want to touch him. I don't know. It just struck me weird. I don't understand it. But what happened? They're laying there, and Paul just gets up. And I was like, well, I guess he's not dead. What's interesting about this, when God heals, he heals, right? Let's just say that I was taken out here and stoned. God, please don't let that happen. And let's say I survived. One of the theories about Jesus, the false theories about Jesus' resurrection, is called the swoon theory. That Jesus didn't die on the cross. He passed out, and he got into a catatonic state, and they thought he was dead. We know that's not true for several reasons. One is they set the sword inside, and blood or water came out, which was proof of death. But they say that when he did that, they laid him in that cold tomb, and he woke up. And when it woke up, he got out of the tomb at that point. And it's one of the dumbest arguments you can make. Why? Why? Jackie, you're being a jerk by saying this. No. This guy had just been crucified, beaten within an inch of his life, then hung on a tree. They laid him in there so he woke up because they put him in a cold tomb. So he went out there and pushed this huge rock out of the way and beat up Roman soldiers and left. And didn't leave any footprints, yeah. He took some palm leaves and got rid of them, right? Paul was beaten within an inch of his life, or he was killed. We don't know which one, right? But when he got up, what did he do? He got up. They didn't go help him up. He got up on his own. I mean, imagine how many bones were broken, how many bruises were on him, and he just got up. And what did he do after that? What does it say? He went right back in, didn't he? I love this guy. He just said, all right, right back in. They just thrown Paul out of the city, left for dead. Imagine the faces that murderers would be when he boldly returns. He just walked right back in. Remember, Paul, if Hollywood would have had a scene, it'd be The Rock playing Paul, right? And he'd raise that eyebrow up when he come in like, I'm the Apostle Paul. No, Paul wasn't a very big guy. Paul was just a normal guy. Later on in his life, he was hunchback and couldn't hardly see. I don't know where he was at this point, but I don't think he was he wasn't somebody that you would just look at and say, man, that's a tough dude. Not any record I've seen of him. But he got up and he walked right back in. I think he did this intentionally, just to say, you can't stop my God. I've told you before, and I'll continue to tell you when we get to a text that talks about, if God calls you to it, he'll put you through it, right? God had a plan for Paul. Did Paul die? I can't answer that. But did God have a plan for Paul? I can answer that. And did God complete his plan for Paul? Yeah, I can answer that. It's encouraging to know that he got up, went back into the city, and waited till the next day. Then he left for Derbe after staying the night in the city. He stayed the whole night. And something tells me he slept good. Why? What else could they do to him? They just stoned him to death, and he got right up. My God is tough. My God is awesome. So I'm just going to go in here and come back in and let you know that my God has the power over death and life. I'm sure that made an impact on those in the city that were led to Christ, the true believers. All right, go on, so I can finish this tonight. Verse 21. After they preached the gospel to that city, talking about Derbe, and they made many disciples, they went to Derbe and did the same thing, and then with made many disciples and returned to Lystra and Iconium and to Antioch. They stopped when they were going. They couldn't be stopped from sharing the gospel, and God produced fruit from the labors. Then they returned to the very cities that they faced persecution. They returned to the very cities that these men followed them from. Now, if you see I don't have a map here, and I thought about bringing a map in and showing y'all the missionary journeys. They kind of had to go back that way to get back where they came from. But they went back boldly, without fear. They returned to the cities and faced persecution with faith and confidence. God is in control. I know we don't see this kind of stuff today. Maybe on the mission field, this stuff is happening where people don't know God and God has allowed things like this to happen. I don't try to make a big thing out of stuff like some people do and try to make stuff up. But I know there are times missionaries were left for dead and God revived them, protected them. And these stories have happened, but this is what happened. They went back with strength. In 22, it says, strengthen the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, saying, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. Now, these are health, wealth, and prosperity gospel preachers. Yeah, I'm going to talk about them again. Why? Because they're one of the biggest threats to the American church. These guys out there on their big boat and their multiple jets are going to tell you how to go through a tribulation. I mean, these guys, when they talk about suffering for Jesus, they have no clout whatsoever. But imagine if you're Paul and Barnabas, especially Paul, and you were just beaten and left for dead, and now you're walking right through the city. Imagine God's testimony right there. That's just awesome. And they said, I'm going to encourage you to let you know that God is with you through your tribulations. Now, he's got a leg to stand on, doesn't he? He says, and they say, how do we know? That's what God's done with me. So when you go through those times of tribulation, this is hard to say because I whine sometimes too. We've got to stop whining and see what God's teaching us and understand that when we learn to go through these things, we have an opportunity to help somebody else go through it. This is not bragging on me. Just understand this is not bragging on me. Anita and I have been through some things with some churches, okay? Some stinky and things. I'm not going to say that'd be nice. Some nasty people have done some nasty things to us at churches, so-called believers. Ernie comes in here after being hurt badly by a church. Now, if I've been a pastor that had been in place for 20 years and never had a bit of problem, would I have been able to encourage Ernie? Well, I don't know what you're doing wrong, son. Everything's hunky-dory for me. But since I've been through those things, and since I could talk to him about it, and I know the hurt. Let me tell you, the hurt doesn't leave. The hurt's still there. People you think that loved you turned their back on you. That hurts. So by me going through that, now I had the opportunity to encourage Ernie. And by doing that, we lose some of our most faithful members. Now he's over at Tungsten, back in the ministry. I'm saying it's not about me. I want to preface that and end with that. It's the fact that God brought me through. Some of y'all know part of the story, but let me tell you what happened, part of it. Lloyd knows because he was involved with this, and Wash too. Friday night, Friday, or whatever day it was, I was getting ready to go to Orlando, actually Kissimmee, St. Cloud, with Sherm Williams. And that Sunday, they were voting on me at the other church, whether to call me as pastor or not. Long story what happened there. We're not going to get into that tonight, especially not on video. Lloyd calls me before that. Says, hey, I've got your resume here. We'd like to talk to you. I said, well, they're voting on my Sunday. If that don't go well, I'll call you. Y'all remember this? I know y'all remember it well. So I get off the plane. I don't know if I talked to Anita or Vernon. It was Vernon, wasn't it? I didn't talk to you about it. And he told me what happened, and I realized I wasn't going to be the pastor there. So I think it was in 30 minutes, I called Lloyd. And here I am. We're at Sherwin-Williams, and we're in this huge rally. We've got 8,000 or more people in this rally. There's 3,500 stores, I think, then 35 to 4,000 stores, then all the reps and stuff. So there's probably 8 to 10,000 people in this arena. And I get a phone call from 434 area code. And all these people are screaming and hollering, and we're doing stuff, and Wash is trying to talk to me about coming here. God is in control, no matter what's going on. That's minor compared to being stoned and dragged out of the city, right? God has a plan. Sometimes we can't see it because it hurts. It hurts bad. So, it says, through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. He's saying, Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble. We also know from Romans chapter 5. I mean, one of the things John told me whenever his dad got hurt, he's like, I'm holding on to Romans 5:3. That perseverance makes us stronger. Going through trials makes us stronger. Trials are good. You learn from them. It makes you stronger. It builds faith. Those things are good to have. I know it's not good when you're going through them. See, what they did is they didn't waste the pain. Y'all heard me say that before, and I'll probably say it 100 more times before I leave here. They didn't waste the pain. When you go through something hard and you don't learn from it, you've wasted the pain. I've given the analogy of working out, right? I haven't got to do legs yet. I finally got back to working out, and I haven't done legs yet. Why haven't I done legs yet? Because doing legs the first time hurts. It hurts bad when you really do them right. And we were getting ready to go to West Virginia, and I had a day to do legs, and I said, I'm not doing legs and then going to West Virginia. Because I might not go back for another 2 weeks if I do that. I didn't want to waste that pain. Because it's wasted pain. If I go through the pain of working out and I don't continue to work out, that pain was wasted. So we as Christians, when we go through pain, when we turn our back on God or don't continue in the service that He's called us to because it hurts a little bit, we wasted the pain. Or we do something stupid. I know that's a word they tell. I've been told I'm not supposed to use in the pulpit. Well, I'm down here now, so we're fine. You do something stupid, and you have to repent of it, and you have to apologize for your stupidity. Has anybody ever done that? I can't raise my feet, right? We've all been there, right? Maybe this week. Yeah, we've all been there. But if I do that and don't learn from it, what have I done? All right, continue on. Verse 23. When they appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they believed. They were committed to supporting these new congregations. They left dedicated men to lead these new believers, but is that enough? No, the apostles, how they choose them. They just said, hey, that guy's got a nice cart. He can do some stuff. No, they prayed and they fasted. They searched God's face for who they called. It's so funny. This happens in a lot of churches. Some little boy has a lot of energy and wants to play preacher in the pulpit. That boy's going to be a preacher one day. Well, who's called him? God may be calling him to be a good mechanic and be able to use that for His glory. They didn't just call people just all willy-nilly. They let God do the calling, and they sought God's face for it. I'm not going to get away from that before I spend too much time there. It says, Boy said the apostles had only left behind a tiny core of believers, and they could hardly be taught anything since the apostles had been there at best only a few weeks. How could this have been the best? How could this little group survive? It survived because the work was actually being done by God. The church was his church. They prayed and fasted. We know that Paul continued. If you read his letters, he's continuing telling these people, I'm praying for you. I'm praying for you. I'm praying for you. Without the prayers of those old women at a Camp Creek Baptist Church, most of them have gone to be with Jesus now, I'd still be a hellion out there. Or God would already took me because I was embarrassing him. I was saved at 6, but I wasn't living for God for a little while there. I know these women were praying for me. Bruce said it had more than once been pointed out that more recent missionary policy had been thought in dangerously idealistic. To recognize converts for only a few weeks standing as leaders in their churches. Perhaps Paul and Barnabas were more conscious of the presence of the power of the Holy Spirit in the believing communities. They saw God working and his Spirit moving. God knew who he had called. See, he said this wasn't done flippantly. They fasted and prayed before any decision was made. In other words, they relied on the Holy Spirit to lead them before they led others. They made a decision. I'm going to follow God, and then I'll lead you. And after that, they went through Pisidia and Pamphylia. See here, it says verse 24, they passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. So what does that mean? They went to those places. And they did the same thing over and over again there. And verse 25, when they spoke the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. However you say that. They went to those towns there. That's about as saying some of these Indian name towns that we have in North Carolina and Virginia that we can't. Sure heard me saying Powhatan before I learned how to say it. Powhatan or whatever. And then they sailed to Antioch. And from there they sailed to Antioch, which they had been commended to the grace of God for the work they had accomplished. And when they'd done this, the people said, man, we are so grateful for the work you did. They returned and began to tell others about God's work. And verse 27, they arrived and gathered the church together and began to report all the things that had been done and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles and spent a long time there with the disciples. This is why I love for us to have missionaries come in, be able to hear what they're doing. In probably a couple weeks, I don't know if we're going to get to the next part of Mark till next year. We might get it on the 26th. God hasn't told me that or not. But it talks about a prophet not being without honor except in his hometown. But sometimes when we have people come from outside and we see God working, it encourages us, right? He says God's church is excited to hear the good news and the gospel effectiveness in the lives of Paul and Barnabas. It was great to see it happening. They sent them out, right? And then they got to see the results of it. I'm sure they had the slide projector, that you had to turn it off and go, and that you could see the heat coming off of it, like all missionaries do. And they had to do that, or it really wasn't a missionary report. Williams says that in saying missionary reported these things, Luke had used the imperfect verb. That means the report was being repeated as the two met with different groups scattered throughout the city. But the word in the singular, there may have been a number of groups meeting separately, but there was only one church. He said they kept telling it over and over and over and over and over again. That's just the encouragement of understanding that God is at work. When we get inside our little holy bubble sometime in the church and we don't see what God's doing outside the church, sometimes we forget that God's working. And I saw just one of my friends posted on Facebook this week that 3 people in their church got saved. No, just we actually before I come over here. Praise God, that's happening. Lives are being changed. But we don't see a whole lot of baptism in here right now. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but right now we don't see it. So it's sometimes, as a pastor and leader of the church, it gets kind of frustrating sometimes, right? Why are other churches having growth? And so, this means we need to follow God more closely, see what God's going to do, and trust that God will do that. We can be encouraged that it's not about us. Let me tell you, many times, pastors think it's all about them. Am I right, Tracy? Come on. I'm going to start preaching to the choir and to the pastors. Forget the choir. I'm going to preach to the pastors. I got to get my numbers up. And they start preaching these sermons that are biblical to get their numbers up. They get down on the floor and they give a 20-minute invitation that everybody in the church can respond to. You know what I mean? I'm not talking about giving people ample opportunity to respond. I'm not talking about sharing the gospel. I'm talking about manipulating people. I know people personally that were manipulated into saying a prayer, and now they're agnostic at best. You know what I mean about agnostic? They don't see any proof of God. They're not in the church. Why? Because somebody convinced them to say a prayer and didn't share the full gospel with them. We can get numbers up here. We could do that. We could change things around. We could do a bunch of different things and get people to come in. And nobody really gets saved. I say let's not do that. I want to see the pews full. You want to see the pews full? Yeah, of course I want to see that. Everybody wants to see that. I want Tracy to have a bigger house to do church in on Sunday. I want to see people coming to the church so they can hear the gospel, so they can get saved. I'm going to leave that alone before I get too much into it. And they spent a long time with the disciples. They took a break and were refreshed by fellow believers. Friends, we need to understand how important that is. I don't understand why there's not more people here on Wednesday night. I don't understand that. I grew up coming every Wednesday night. It's kind of a habit for me. I enjoy it. But the encouragement we can give each other here right now is missed by so many. I think it's what most people missed about Sunday school, right? Don't y'all agree? I mean, Bible study is a very important part of Sunday school, but another important part of Sunday school is the coming together, encouraging one another. That's important. That's why it's on the back screen back there. We don't have it up here. I turned it off. We know, and this is going to be the first sermon of the new year. We're going to talk about this. And just a little, I'm going to spoiler a little bit. We're not going to have a church motto anymore after the first of the year. I know Nathan named this our church motto. We're not changing this. We're changing the intention of it. It's going to be our church mission. Understand the difference? More to come. I'll explain more on the first of the year. But to glorify God, reach the lost, and the last part is very important. To encourage the saints. That's so important. I don't know if it encourages Tracy when he sees me in the bus at Parkview, but it encourages me to see him. It encourages me to see Bailey here today. I tease him. I love him to death. And when I see that family, even though they're not part of our church, they encourage me. When I see other pastors, I see people from other churches. I tease, but it's the truth. Before COVID, I ate meals with as many people in this community outside of our church from other churches as I have my own people. Because I'd go into McDonald's and there's somebody from Buffalo there, or somebody from Averett, or, anywhere around here. And because you're in a small town with a small and I'm a pastor in a small town, everybody knows who I am. If I wanted to do something wrong, I couldn't, right? But it's an encouragement to sit down with them, and for them and for myself. So continue to encourage one another that God is able. Y'all believe he's able? He is. Paul was either dead or that close. He didn't have to spend 6 weeks at Meadowview to get better. He got right up. He walked right back into the lion's den, unafraid, because my God and your God is sovereign. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you for the encouragement of your word that if we follow you, your protection and your guarantee is sure. Lord, help us to encourage one another. Help us to love one another. Help us to be willing to sacrifice for one another in order for people to see the gospel. And Lord, that's those hurts and pains that we try to hide. Let's not be afraid to share those, Lord, because maybe someone else is going to do that. And to encourage them and to lift them up through their pain. through the pain we've already been through than you brought us through. Lord, help us not to waste the pain, but use that pain to bring others more and ourselves like you. In Christ's name, amen.